YouTube just posted an advertisement that wasn't um, um, a mining magnate. It was called the Citizens Party. Um, Not really sure if the Citizens Party is worth supporting at this point. They seem to be talking about some things which sound like they're fairly important, such as they've got some issues with the banks. Fair enough. The industry is a little bit dodgy. The auditors worked overtime and didn't get heard very much actually. Um, and they did their best. So um, suffice to say that industry was frustrating for people who work there. So having a crack at the banking system is probably a good thing to do, but behind the banking system is a much larger story that others have been talking about, such as the infiltration of certain industries in Australia by organisations from overseas that are definitely causing damage there, such as BlackRock or Vanguard. So, what people from the United States have said about those two organisations suggests that merely reforming the banking industry isn't acceptable. I mean, there needs to be a complete change to all of that. I mean, the organisations like BlackRock and Vanguard can have no say in any of the subsidiaries of any of the corporations that have their origin in those countries as well. And that includes Sky News, and that includes MSNBC. It includes quite a fair few corporations. And in fact, it apparently includes about 90% of the US economy, which means it includes a fair amount of corporations with subsidiaries in Australia, pretty much the entire fast food industry, and a whole host more than that. So, that type of structure of business with the stock traders or whatever they're called, like BlackRock or Vanguard, needs to be prohibited in Australia, and it needs to be reformed so that the overseas organisations such as that cannot own those businesses in Australia, and it also needs to be the case that foreign militaries cannot own businesses in Australia as well. It also needs to be the case that there needs to be a complete restructuring of the mining industry. At present, we have a small minority of individuals who allegedly engage in most of the mining industry's activities in public. In private, they're part of a system of corporations which involves collusion and cartel behaviour with foreign operatives that were part of a larger cartel environment that, as you can see, has had deleterious consequences in the United States of America in the present tense. So we need to basically have investigations into the personal lives of all the mining magnates and their professional lives and their associates to see if they're engaging in international collusion activities and corruption activities. And moreover, we need to be able to do so in a investigative environment which limits the collusion and corruption activities that they're alleging that the major parties in particular, as well as some of the minor parties, have participated in. Now, one of the places, so in other words, what Citizens Party was offering was a Bandaid, and a standard finger pointing, but not an in-depth discussion into what needs to happen. It wasn't radical enough, for lack of a better word. The other thing too is they've gone, and one of the things that's said on their site. See, the thing with Clive Palmer is the moment he said that he wanted to be like Trump, you can rule it out. Okay, he's a goner. He's not happening. Okay, he's not supported. In fact, he's bankrupt. He's gone. He's going to get kicked out of the fucking country. Okay, we won't have that. And the moment that was it Friendly Geordies showed that Gina Rhinehardt was in leagues with Elon Musk and people like that. She's a goner. She's out of the country. Deport her. Kick her out. After what we've seen in the United States and whatever else, get rid of them. We'll have none of that here. They're both traitors. Okay? And you can say, oh, that's guilt by association. Not with the way they do business. Not a chance. Now that is collusion. That's cartel behaviour, what they're doing. You can guarantee it. And so, they're goners, mate. Absolute fucking goners. With the other mining companies and whatever else, there is a numerous number of international mining companies. There's a whole bunch of them. BHP Billiton is no longer Australian. The Billiton part is your first clue. Santos, Perelia. What else is there? Adani. There's a whole bunch of them. And each is doing in different places. We've had there's been numerous complaints by different communities made about different types of mining going into their community without their consent and causing them harm. CSG is one example of that. The other thing too is that where there's concern about Citizens Party, is that they said on their site that something about they went and touched something once that the others wouldn't touch, which was a pro-nuclear energy argument. And unfortunately, in the Australian context, you can never be pro-nuclear energy because what it takes to get that stuff out of the ground, it causes a level of devastation to the ecosystems that it's from that's unacceptable. Usually that uranium is found in international heritage listed sites of enormous ecological and social importance. Moreover, historically, one of the things they have done with the nuclear waste is they've done attempts to dump it racistly on remote communities. The town of Muckaty went through that once and had to have a pro bono case to prevent them from being treated like a nuclear waste dump. They won the case as far as we know because it was an egregious human rights abuse on their persons. And so as a consequence of that sort of thing, just in the Australian context alone, that's unacceptable. It's also unacceptable on the grounds that Australia has more sunlight than it does rain, and it would be absolutely stupid to not harness that solar power. It would be ridiculous. We shouldn't use technology that supposedly comes from Mr. Musk. Solar panel technology has many different producers. Australia should be a massive producer in solar panel technology if they're not already. And so it sort of makes more sense to go down that path. It's already the case that you'll probably find that solar panels are becoming far more popular, particularly with the rising cost of electricity and and living costs. And moreover, some solar panels can be folded up and taken with you in your little van or car that you've outfitted to live in because you can't afford a rental. So solar power is the way to go in Australia. Not nuclear. Supporting nuclear is stupid, particularly when we are supposed to be in a nuclear deproliferation era. So some decades ago, there was a treaty signed by most of the world's countries to stop producing nuclear weapons. They even alleged, falsely by the way, that the US and allies' invasion of Iraq in 2003, most likely, was as a consequence of Mr. Hussein producing weapons of mass destruction. However, the International Criminal Court actually found George W. Bush's administration guilty of crimes against humanity for not only making a false allegation as a pretext for war, because Hussein did not have the capability to make nuclear weapons, but they'd also used nuclear cluster bombs on unarmed civilians in that conflict. Now, as you probably not noticed, that the mainstream media hasn't widely reported on that, but you can look it up and you'll find that that's what happened. One of the places you can find out what that was happened was Mr. Assange's WikiLeaks project, and he also, interestingly, some years ago, was involved in the PayPal leaks. It would appear that they alleged that Anonymous had been a hacker group that had hacked into PayPal and nicked a bunch of credit card numbers plus a whole bunch of other information. And there was some kind of Visa, MasterCard scandal that went with it. And all of that stuff's gone to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And what's really interesting about that in the present tense context is you'll probably notice that Mr. Musk likes to tout himself as basically a member of Anonymous. And Julian Assange is suddenly, as Donald Trump has been, shortly after Assange allegedly got released via Saipan, suddenly Donald Trump wins the unwinnable election with the assistance of Mr. Musk. Okay, and so I'm going to ask some questions about that, about collusion between potential false opposition groups. We don't know who Mr. Assange really was false opposition. It could have been real opposition and turned. It could have been a case of timing for expediency or suggestion. However, it might also be the case that certain types of leaks are permitted when it has some kind of political expediency and others are not. So with that kind of stuff, it suggests a very huge amount of corruption and a huge amount of agent provocateur behaviour within the activist community. And, of course, Mr. Assange getting enormous amounts of publicity for what he's done would qualify as someone who would be what you might call a celebrity whistleblower, which technically puts on the back burner people who are real bona fide whistleblowers who were often relegated to crazy people camps and ignored, whereas that one who most likely has done what you might call legitimate supported whistleblowing is in camp popular. So on that particular subject, the whistleblower legislation was touted by juice media to be what you might call not helpful. And so we're in a bit of an awkward situation where controlled leaks have happened and controlled information has happened. It's also the case that artificial intelligence algorithms associated with Google and other forms of social media have been used to use demographic information collected by said social media users to funnel them into stereotypes and false demographics about information. So they are directed and receive notifications or whatever else that direct them into a particular ideological pathway. That's to and with the long-term hopes that they will become demographically aligned with a particular worldview or ideology that creates a particular consequence. The objective is to make the populace as predictable as possible by actually controlling what they think. This is an outgrowth of what used to be like with mainstream media and television, where that was the only source of information, so people usually went with that. But in this case, they've created the illusion that it's free information. It can come from anyone and anywhere, so it's not controlled by the government, which is obviously a lie, because as anyone would know, Google and its AI programs are very much in leagues with the AI programs of OpenAI, Stargate AI, and other groups which have a very strong military industrial background, and in fact the internet itself was actually a product of the US military. So being distrustful of the internet is a wise option. With that, the data retention programs that happened internationally also happened in Australia and were protested by some, but not by enough, because, people were told not to, basically. And we're not seeing a radical position for addressing that issue by a Citizens Party. In fact, we haven't seen that by any party. What we've seen so far is parochial dog whistling style behaviour that sort of does Bandaid stuff to deal with the various and sundry minor scratches that actually don't really address the underlying problems. So once you get to the point where the big four banks are corrupt, for example, or the real estate industry has had a bubble and already burst, okay, that is decades after the background manipulation has already occurred from the international liberal and corporate forces. So with that, Citizens Party does use the word neoliberal in a disparaging fashion, which suggests that they're ideologically trying to give the appearance that they're aligned with those that are opposed to, non-Keynesian capitalism, in accordance with some other people's description of how that works. And they haven't described that they are aligned to fight to the left or fight to the right. They appear to be a party of minor reforms. The minor reforms are insufficient. It is actually the case that Australia, being a republic, should be the standard. It is in fact the standard already. It needs to be successfully argued that, first of all, we need to acknowledge that the Constitution is unlawful to begin with. It has a by proxy sitter administration status, not a de jure status, as a consequence of the ongoing treaty issue. It also needs to be argued that the treaties need to be between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. It cannot be between institutions and Aboriginal people, because the institutions do not have the de jure status in which to do it. It also needs to be argued that the sitter administration, through its constitution, said that Australia is secular. Okay, that's okay. In a country that does not have a Bill of Rights in its constitution, and had to pass it as statutes. And interestingly enough, during the Gillard administration, and probably watered down by other administrations, or even some of the things that administration did as well. For that to be the case, you might go, oh, hang on, what's going on here? But actually, the actual constitution defines Australia as secular, in the sense that people have the right to free choice on a matter, and the state shall not intervene or have any say in that matter. The problem with that is that it's a conflict of interest to also have the English crown involved, or the monarchy involved at all in the constitution, on the basis that the English monarch is a theocrat, ceremonially is, and actuality is the head of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. The actual administrative functions of that duty is given to the Archbishop of Canterbury. However, the actual head of state and head of church for England is the English monarch. And so, even though it's a ceremonial thing, it's also a issue in the sense that they basically said Australia is governed by a foreign theocrat, but we'll just pretend it's secular, and we'll have like locals do the job. So that's put in an awkward position, because there's these little loopholes that they've got where these other countries and corporations and religions think that they can get slices of the pie, and they can manipulate those people in a manner that confuses people. But Australia's like this and that, and then why are they doing that for? It's because there's too many loopholes, including at the constitutional level. the basic founding structure is inaccurate. So the idea of that is that we don't actually have any political party in Australia that's legal to begin with. Technically, political parties in Australia are against the law. They're against the law because there is no, as far as we know, there is no provision for political parties in the Constitution. There's no provision against it. It's also a case that the Constitution, it has not been ratified through treaty process, and subsequently does not apply as anything other than a by proxy. We're doing this, which to stop the language being confusing. By proxy means it's what we're doing for now while we figure out the rest. Okay? You need to be concerned about things like the sort of we'll buy your country out mindset of the billionaires. They might think that they can buy Australia and buy that land, it becomes theirs. That's not the case. They're not able to do that. There needs to be a very strong move in Australia that Australia cannot be bought by overseas interest. As it presently stands, if you've paid for a mortgage or rent, you've been ripped off. There is the idea of the Crown owning 20 centimetres under the soil is a furphy that they use with false titles and certificates to take away your right to engage in what is essentially the commons. It is considered the commons land in general everywhere, except for one thing. The actual traditional borders of the original peoples still stand as they were before 1770, regardless of what anyone might say, do, or think. That is still the case. It's also the case that those definitions are more complicated than native title will have you suggest, and they've attempted to hedge pin things with that in a manner that's caused complexity that might not necessarily need to be there. And it is also the case that people are still to this day practicing traditional law on their countries, whether they know it, like it, or not. And therefore, they still have their sovereignty. So, if a person gets forcibly removed from their country, that does not mean they are forcibly, they lose their sovereignty. Sovereignty is supposed to transcend that sort of thing. I mean, Russia tried to claim that it owned the Crimea because it invaded it. Okay, Ukraine disagreed, and most of the world disagreed as well, and told Russia you're a bunch of dickheads. Australia, in some respects, is a bit like the Crimea. It's a spot that is independent of both Ukraine and Russia, and traditionally has been affiliated with the Ukraine and had some rough times with Russia, but technically stands on its own. I mean, no one's ever considered that possibility, have they? That the Crimea belongs to the Crimea. Australia belongs to Australia. Australia does not belong to the UK, and Australia does not belong to the US. So that part of the Citizens Party argument that Australia should not really be roped into US and UK stuff makes sense. They haven't necessarily specified that Australia shouldn't be roped into Russian or Chinese stuff. Having other countries as trading partners seems acceptable unless the trades involve shares and shareholdings in land, stocks, bonds, or companies that result in an unstabilisation of power away from the Australian populace to overseas, which, by the way, typically happens because the only time Australians own shares is in their superannuation, and the casualisation of the workforce, the unemployment rate, and the fact that superannuation only came in the sort of late 1980s, and the fact that we have a massively ageing population typically means that Australians have very little to no super. If they have super at all, it's typically managed by an investment fund. They don't really get to see what goes on there, and that means it's subject to the whims of the stock market, which is almost exclusively controlled by companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, which make that shit go up and down as they see fucking fit. So the United States has a little bit of a conniption whether or not Trump has tariffs or not, they'll do that to show that they can fuck with it until they get the desired effect that they want. So they don't actually care if they're fucking around with the US stock exchanges, causes recessions in other countries, as long as they gain ideological control over what's going on in the US government so that they can have whatever they want in the background. So that's something you need to be really concerned about. That's not something Citizens Party has addressed. And you can rest assured Clive Palmer wouldn't touch that because he's from one of the billionaires that actually is part of that problem. So have fun.